I attended a training.
5, 4.
Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. We are especially privileged tonight to be joined by Susan Doctor, the leading national specialist in the fetal alcohol syndrome field. She's come to San Jose from Reno to provide a week-long training for FAS trainers sponsored by Family Education Foundation. Roughly 10% of infants born to women who drink heavily may have fetal alcohol syndrome. Another 20 to 30% may show a partial expression of the syndrome or fetal alcohol effect. Both are 100% preventable, yet only 55% of women of childbearing age have ever heard of these syndromes. Welcome, Doctor. I appreciate you being here. Well, you're a PhD candidate, I know.
Yes.
But I'm glad you took time out of your training to join us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay. Now, as I mentioned, you are somebody with tremendous amount of expertise in this field, and I was curious about how you became interested in the fetal alcohol syndrome.
Well, actually, the way it all started was I'm an educator. I was first a teacher and then a counselor, and then my most recent job as an educator was I was the coordinator of our alcohol and drug program for the school district in Reno. And the information started coming across my desk, and I would read it and think about kids that I had been their counselor, that I'd had in the classroom, you know, whatever. And it really was startling to me. So I wanted to learn more out of my own personal interest, and then the more I learned, the more my passion grew, because it explained so much to me that I hadn't been able to relate to before in terms of understanding what all we see, especially in education, but now I would say generically in the culture, period.
Okay, that's an interesting statement. So maybe the effects of, what, at least a decade? Or I don't know, how long have we been identifying fetal alcohol syndrome?
Fetal alcohol syndrome in the United States was first diagnosed in 1973.
Okay.
So the literature out of Seattle, Washington, which is where it was first diagnosed, is well over 20 years old now, which gives us the benefit of longitudinal study. The study out of Seattle includes the ages from 6 to 51. Wow. So we can talk about adolescents, we can talk about adults. We have real good information about it.
Okay. So in terms of personal work with this, you've worked with adults as well as children?
All I do, yes,
this is all
ages.
You do.
I started with just schools, but then there is such a need, and they don't evaporate when they turn 10, you know. So the many, many service agencies that deal with this problem have asked me to come in and work with them. So just about everything you can think of.
In some ways, it reminds me of the movement with attention deficit disorder, where up until 10 years ago, I know I was taught in graduate school that we outgrow it by the time we're 13 or 14 years old. And we've come to find that, as a matter of fact, there's residual symptoms that continue onward through adulthood.
Well, it's interesting that you would bring up attention deficit, because the literature out of Seattle tells us that a very, very high percentage of those either fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effect are also attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity.
Okay.
And I have a belief, admittedly I also have a bias, but I have a belief that there are a lot of individuals who are diagnosed ADHD or ADD who may in fact also be under the umbrella of either fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effect. Thereby they would have further problems that we wouldn't know about, that they wouldn't be getting appropriate response to.
Okay, so then maybe ADD becomes the umbrella, and maybe some of the other soft signs, as they're referred to, are not addressed.
Well, no, I would reverse that.
Oh, okay.
I would say that FAS is the umbrella, because it is the organicity from which the ADD results, but other things would result as well. So that would be the umbrella, and then and our challenge is to find out what are the other kinds of things so that we can address them as well as we do with the ADHD.
Okay. Let's take a look at our first graphic, which describes some risks, and then we'll look at some prevalence, and then we'll talk about the specifics of the difference between fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol effects.
Okay.
We have our first one, the most significant factors that may cause fetal alcohol syndrome might be persistent drinking during pregnancy among women with chronic alcohol problems, a previous history of alcohol problems from the mother, increased parity, meaning a number of previous deliveries. Okay, I believe that we'll address a few more in just a moment. But in terms of heavy drinking, you know, one of the things about this particular syndrome is there's always that question, how do you define heavy drinking?
Right.
You know, are we talking about a drink a week, 7 drinks? What?
You're asking me to define heavy
I'm
drinking.
asking you what heavy drinking is. That's right.
I am a recovering person.
Okay.
And so you have to remember that I'm going to put that in the context of the denial that I came through. You know, I remember my first, when I heard what heavy drinking was, I was astonished. I thought, no, that's ridiculous. That's moderate drinking, you know. Okay. In terms of fetal alcohol syndrome, actually, they don't specify numbers of drinks because there are so many variables that impact it. But what we know is that the literature tells us that fetal alcohol syndrome basically comes from women who drink chronically, meaning every day, lots, large amounts, or binge drink large amounts. And then parity, i.e. how many children they've had, where they are in the birth order, plays a major role. As a treatment person, you know about the progression of addiction.
Yes, I do.
And so the thing with parity is actually, I believe, to be about the progression of addiction. Because my younger children are going to be born to me when I'm older, and my addiction will have progressed farther. So my body will have been more ravaged by the substance use and other things as well, you know. Plus tolerance will mean that I'll be putting more substances in my body.
Which also explains why, and we've talked about this with adult children of alcoholics, why you can have several siblings, all of whom have a different memory of their mother's drinking.
Right.
Because it depends on where she was in her drinking at that time.
When we're speaking about fetal alcohol, either syndrome or effect, the usual scenario, and please notice that I qualified that, but the usual scenario is that the older children in the family present fewer symptoms than the younger children, assuming that there was nothing to interrupt mom's use. For what we just talked about, that's those reasons.
Okay. Let's take a look at a couple more characteristics that we can address. Another factor might be increased maternal age, smoking, and nutrition.
Right.
And if 4 of the factors we've discussed are present, the probability of fetal alcohol syndrome becomes 50% higher. So that it sounds like the syndrome's created by a combination of factors.
Right.
That we're looking at drinking, we're looking at nutrition, looking at probably health in general.
Yes.
Sounds like maternal age, birth order.
Stress, prenatal care is a large thing. Timing, when, during gestation, if mom is not a chronic user, because whatever's developing at the time is what would be the most likely to be impacted if there's going to be impact, so timing. And then the fact of the matter is, in our culture today, polydrug use is the norm.
Yes.
Very few women would use only one substance. And so if there's polydrug use, what were the other substances? What was the combination? All of those factors come into play. If everyone in this room were diagnosed fetal alcohol syndrome, we would not present the same symptoms because of all those variables.
Which I would guess creates a bigger challenge in diagnosis.
Oh, definitely. Actually, the diagnosis, there are 3 criterion for diagnosis, and they have to be there. It creates a huge challenge in terms of intervention, because there is no prototype. So you have to determine, okay, how is Mary affected, and address that. How is Susan affected, and address that, and you know.
So it sounds, actually, that sounds like working with learning disabilities in general, which is even, let's say we both have dyslexia. Your dyslexia can present very different from my dyslexia. So,
exactly.
So then treatment, which we'll talk about in the second half, really becomes very personalized.
Exactly. It should be. Unfortunately, it is not always, but it should be, yes.
Okay. So let's take a look at the next set of factors that we might want to consider.
Okay.
For a diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome, and you mentioned 3, these must be the 3. Intrauterine and or postnatal growth retardation, characteristic craniofacial abnormalities including a small head, small eye slits, crossed eyes, flattened mid-face, thin upper lip, and a poorly developed philtrum, and then central nervous system dysfunction including possible developmental delays, hyperactivity, inattentiveness, impulsiveness, and mental retardation. Let's talk first about the intrauterine, and then we'll go to a picture where we can look at the actual facial characteristics, okay?
One thing that I would like to say before we say
Certainly.
anything more is that there was quite a list there.
Yes.
And that is what is referred to as a constellation of characteristics. Very seldom would you see an individual with everything that was just mentioned.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
In fact, is that's part of diagnosis, I would guess, would be the specific clusters of those symptoms.
Exactly. There have to be the 3 criterion for a syndrome diagnosis. That's what defines a syndrome, where you have whatever the criterion are and they're repeated in every birth. Okay. But then within those 3 areas, there can be deviation of how it presents.
Okay. So we talk about intrauterine retardation. Does that mean that in the fetal development, the child is underdeveloped, maybe small? Or
Right. It's a growth retardation. So you often see what is considered small size would be, in terms of birth weight, would be like 5 pounds, 5 ounces or less. And then they're often short and small, sometimes failure to thrive, not always.
Okay.
And that, like ADHD, will sometimes remain with the individual throughout life, and some will fill out more like at puberty or later.
Okay.
So it varies even within that context.
Actually, that raises a point I was going to ask, which is I know when we look at children who are born, for example, under the influence of cocaine.
Right.
You know, some of them will developmentally catch up, per se,
Very quickly.
and do not have long-term symptomology. Now, when we look at fetal alcohol syndrome, is it possible for that same process to happen?
Alcohol is a solvent. It's different.
Okay.
A solvent breaks down, it tears apart. And we have not talked about that 3rd criterion yet, but the central nervous system
Right.
is the brain.
Okay.
And when you have central nervous system dysfunction, you have organicity, meaning you have brain damage.
Okay.
That does not get cured.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
It can be addressed. You can get different outcomes. You know, it's not a hopeless situation in any way, but it doesn't get cured.
Okay. So then what you would do is try to address, in that case, with the brain damage, you would address the delays enough to help them compensate, as opposed to curing it. It's sort of like, here's how you can manage
Well,
this.
there's many, many, many different ways that we have to address the central nervous system dysfunction. Many different things that I hope we get a chance to talk about.
Okay, well, in fact, that's a very good segue. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. When we return, we'll learn more about identification and prevention and treatment. Stay with us.